Absolutely. Yeah, just whether I'm asked to or not. Have you guys had a great time today? Have you learned a lot?
Yeah!
The sessions were fantastic. We had everything from our civic language to decoding the election results. And I don't know about you, but I'm pretty excited about democracy right now. Is anyone else excited about democracy? So I'm Kevin Singer. I'm communications lead here at Pace, and it's been just a joy getting to know many of you here. Thank you. And a lot of you may or may not know that I've been posting pictures on LinkedIn of you enjoying our sessions. And if you haven't followed us on LinkedIn or Blue Sky or Twitter, I would love to invite you to do that. It makes me look really good. So the purpose of this last session is to actually begin to think about what are the best next steps for democracy, for all of the good work that we're doing. And so how this is going to work is each one of our fabulous thought leaders here are going to give sort of a TED Talk style lightning round talk to us. And we've intentionally asked them to not be afraid to be even a little bit provocative. Now, within bounds, but to push us, right? With what we already know and what we think we might know. What, practically speaking, are the best next steps for us in our field? Does that sound good to everybody?
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to do. And Eric, I thought we would start with you.
All right, sounds good.
Oh, one thing I'll say too is I promise we're going to leave a lot of time for Q&A this time. So be thinking about your questions, and I'll also be encouraging, of course, our panelists to speak to each other as well. So we will start with Eric.
All right, is this on?
It is not.
All right.
Okay, there we go. Hello, everybody. Great to be here. I was asked to teach everyone the Shim Sham. No, that's not what I'm supposed to be doing. So really quickly, my colleague Chaim is someplace here. He also worked on the research we're going to be talking about today. So if you have questions and can't connect with me, connect with Chaim. This is a lightning talk, so in case you're like, wow, I'm trying to write down stuff really fast, I brought a one-page cheat sheet. If you want one, they're there, so you can grab one later. It's got the basic points. So what I'm going to share is based upon what is in the current global narrative landscape about pro-democracy narratives and pro-authoritarian narratives. And I'm here to say we've got to go upstream. And we need to be working and thinking about shifting the enabling environment, moving beyond election by election work, and really looking at what do we need to do to expand civic space by creating a more fertile environment for it. So first of all, I'm going to be focusing a lot today on a thing called narrative. So I want to really quickly say what is narrative, and speaking of which, I need my slides.
Just right.
There we go. All right. So really quickly, lots of people have been using the word narrative. What we mean when we talk about narrative is that narratives are the big meta stories through which we as human beings filter our understanding of the world around us, how it works, and in turn it shapes what we think, what we believe, and what we do. So these big meta stories are critically important. And over the last 2 years, we've had the incredible opportunity through several projects, some funded by public sector agencies, some funded by philanthropy, to study and identify and deconstruct the most dominant and salient pro-democratic and pro-authoritarian narratives in 19 countries on 5 continents. So I'm here today to share what can we learn from the global democracy narratives landscape. And first of all, we have to understand, I'm going to share 5 key lessons of what we've learned from these. I'm going to do it at a very high level and happy to chat with folks in more detail about it later. And one of the things that's a big picture takeaway is that there's a real challenge and an opportunity here because the upstream space on narrative is being dominated by pro-authoritarian narratives. They are far more dominant and far more salient than pro-democratic narratives. And I'm going to tell you a few things why. So the first critical lesson learned is that authoritarian actors are very skilled and effective and are putting significant resource into being consistent in orchestrating and weaponizing narratives that legitimize their actions and delegitimize and create distrust in democratic institutions and democratic principles. And these upstream anti-democratic narratives are far more dominant and salient than pro-democracy narratives in the current ecosystem, which we need to change. and they do not stop at borders. The narratives that are coming out of the PRC, the Russian Federation, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Modi in India, Bukele, impact narratives in the US, and the narratives in the US we can see showing up in all of the countries I've just named and many, many others. Two, narratives are absolutely critical because they create the fertile environment either that builds resilience against or creates easy spread of misdis and malinformation. Because if you believe an upstream meta story, you use that narrative as a filter to decide which facts, which data, which stories you will pay attention to, believe, or act upon. So there's been a lot of discussion the last 2 days about should we be talking about facts or emotions. We need to make sure that we understand that people will believe the facts that connect with the narrative that they already believe. 3, the core to impactful narratives are closely held values. They are how we make our decisions. They are what trigger the things that we prioritize. And these closely held values are utilized really effectively by authoritarians whose narratives are grounded in closely held values like security, prosperity, honesty. Yeah, authoritarians use the value of honesty a lot by saying democratic institutions are corrupt, therefore we should overthrow them. 4th, democratic narratives, the ones that are pro-democratic, the 5 most salient dominant pro-democratic narratives globally, are seldom framed in ways that evoke values, often use technical language. It means a lot to those of us in this room, but human beings on this planet don't walk around talking about rule of law. They talk about being treated fairly by the justice system. And they take for granted the extent to which people understand and define democracy as being more than just elections. So there is work to do to improve our own narratives. And 5, and really interestingly, the democracy brand is very, very strong. This study was in countries with majority populations of different religions, different ethnicities, different histories, on 5 continents. The vast majority of people in every place we've studied say they think that the most preferred form of government is democracy. And that's why one of the most salient and dominant pro-authoritarian narratives is democracy appropriation. They are taking the word democracy and redefining it. That comes in right after enemies, others, and outsiders, and security justifies all as one of the top 3 dominant pro-authoritarian narratives. So it's critical that we need to put energy and effort into defining democracy as being a set of principles and beliefs that connect to values so that it cannot be appropriated. But we can change this. We have an opportunity to advance a proactive, upstream, evidence-based narrative that connects our democracy ideals with closely held values and to put the infrastructure behind it that will support people utilizing it. And to do so, we have the opportunity to move from these really well-resourced efforts that are dominating the information landscape and that delegitimize democracy, and in doing so create distrust, close civic space, and legitimize authoritarian action, to a much more infertile, enabling environment that strengthens democratic principles, institutions, and can expand civic space, civic engagement, and can inoculate against misdis and malinformation, and have people more resilient to be able to advance a more innovative democracy. Together, we can do 2 things. I'm urging that we consider, because our prompt for today was, what should we be doing next? There's no one silver bullet. This is one of the things we should be doing next. We need to go upstream. We need to develop and test, build an evidence-based, deploy and support pro-democracy narratives that create a shared definition for democracy that is not just I voted. Bukele in El Salvador every day says, I got rid of the Supreme Court and replaced them, and it was the most democratic thing possible because I was elected. So we have to expand that definition, and we have to connect it with values so there's deep conviction for democratic principles. And we need to play the long game. This won't happen in an election cycle by an election cycle. We need to invest over the next decade to create a social expectation, a norm, that the concept of small L liberal democracy and the principles behind it are something that are part of how we identify as a society, and that we care about a multiracial, pluralistic democracy and are willing to stand up for it. Well, I want to end by saying, around the world, people want democracy, and while they don't link all these democratic principles with democracy, when we test them individually, we actually care a lot about each of those principles. So we can connect those principles to the concept of democracy, and it's an amazing asset we have that we are not leveraging, and we are allowing to be taken from us. We must go upstream, and we can go upstream. It's long overdue, and when we do it, together we can ensure a democracy that is free, fair, and fearless. Thank you.
Turn it over to y'all. What did you hear there? What surprised you, intrigued you? What did you hear about narratives and democracy appropriation? What are your reactions to that?
Just the theme of going upstream. And as you said, it's not about the rule of law, it's about treating people fairly. So talking more like normal people, I think is important as we build narratives. So those two things stood out to me.
I think that long game piece was very important to me. This notion that it's not going to be an election cycle or a quarter, that this long game is important in terms of investments.
Mine on too. Perfect. I'm glad you defined narrative. We define it differently in journalism, so happy to talk more.
Excellent. Stephen, would you like to go next?
Sure.
All right.
Well, I like this call and response format. I'm actually a jazz musician as well as this work, so I enjoy this. My name is Stephen. I'm going to breakdance up here for the next 5 minutes. No, I'm really grateful to be here. Big thank you to Kristen and the whole PACE team. I've been a fellow traveler with many people in this room to build out the pro-democracy and pluralism fields over the last 10 years. I met many of you when I was founding Future Caucus, the cross-partisan organization of young legislators. And I'm now building the entertainment office for our field, Bridge Entertainment Labs, or BELL for short. Now, between those two journeys, I ran for Senate in Wisconsin. And I remember hearing from a voter in north central Wisconsin, a rural part of the state, who came up to me after an event on veterans, and she said, "For so long, we've learned not to trust." And what she was referring to is we've learned not to trust politicians, we've learned not to trust institutions, not to trust people of the other political party. And there are solutions represented in this room that are working right now to diffuse that distrust that she's feeling. But the question is, are we telling stories that are reaching and resonating with that voter? Since the campaign, I've been obsessed with the question of which stories do we choose to tell as a society, and which stories do we choose not to tell? And I believe the next big move for our space is culture change and telling a new story of us as a cultural phenomenon. Not only because culture change is further upstream than political changes we just talked about, but I believe it's our best lever for scale. I'll share an example. So we work with a filmmaker, an Academy Award winner, Morgan Neville, who describes culture as how we define ourselves and how we define others. So when we're talking about culture change, this is not just about getting a celebrity endorsement, although get that if you can. This is about building an ecosystem of storytelling that weaves together the disparate strands of the American social fabric. And that filmmaker, Morgan, he's been doing it for 30 years. He tells the story of Mr. Rogers, Won't You Be My Neighbor, through the lens of a story of belonging. He tells the story of Johnny Cash through the lens of social cohesion, how his music united Americans across some of our biggest differences, from punk rockers to evangelical Christians. But it's also about working with storytellers who are not like Morgan, those who maybe don't prioritize our issues but have influence. One of the movies that hit #1 in the box office this year was called Civil War. And it was a movie that imagined a second American Civil War. It was pretty unnerving to watch. Maybe some of you have seen it. And when we reached out to the studio putting out that film, it was clear very quickly they'd spent no time thinking about the impact of their film on our culture or our politics. But ultimately, we were able to go in and help them elevate solutions to toxic polarization as a feature of their global press tour. So we can work with storytellers who, again, don't prioritize this but still have outsized cultural impact. And final example I'll share, it's not just about entertainment, it's also about infotainment. As a broadcast political commentator, I have found that the practice of showing up on some of these platforms with what I would call heterodoxical views that have nuance, that cut across our silos and our political echo chambers, is a radical act. It is not incentivized by the business model. So there's a lot of work to change that we need to do. But I will say right now, just in the last few weeks since the election, I'm seeing some real change, some real thinking about how we can bring in some new voices. I believe this moment is more ripe than it's been in the last generation to reimagine news talk platforms. So I'll just close with this. Over the last 15 years, I've had the chance to see behind the curtain, like in The Wizard of Oz, and see how our political and media systems really work. I can't unsee what I've seen. The division industrial complex, the polarization vortex that nearly every issue we face as a country gets fed into, it is real and it's powerful. We need a solution that is of the moment and on the scale required of this challenge. And I believe one of those big solutions is the storytelling industry. And we need to be bold about experimenting and innovating around culture change and not be shy about it. When I was first getting involved in this field, a mentor shared a dangerous piece of wisdom with me. He said, if you think someone ought to do something, that person's probably you. That is a call that every single person in this room has answered, is answering right now, and I'm deeply grateful for that, and I'm grateful to work with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So what are the panelists' thoughts on the storytelling argument made there? How does that hit you? I feel like it resonates a bit with what you were saying as well. It's upstream narratives.
I mean, very, very, very deeply. Is it song?
Hold that down. Yeah, hold that one down.
All right, there we go.
Yep.
Absolutely. Obviously, I'm a storyteller and I love it. And I think one of the really powerful things that you were talking about was this idea about we need to set a culture change. Because really what we're talking about is a culture of democracy, is where we identify and say I'm part of our cultures. And I love how you were just telling it. Thank you.
I was struck by the let's watch a movie and then let's talk about it, right? I think that that's not something that we should do more of, is let's all read a story and then let's talk about it, right?
Yeah, I just think this concept of media and financial models and culture and how they interact, being very deliberate about that, is incredibly important. We can't miss it. So I'm glad you elevated it.
Jessica,
This is like American Idol, I feel like.
so we'll have Jessica go next. Jessica, I want to put you on the spot just briefly, having worked for the Associated Press and having written a lot of stories yourself. I'm curious, from a journalism perspective, like how much is there to work with here in terms of the stories that are told in certain mass mediums and sort of the work you've done with that?
How do I do this? That's good. Okay, that's for that. Well, thanks for asking. I thought actually the most useful thing I could probably do for you today as a journalist is to bring you a little bit inside the newsroom and talk a little bit about, thank you, the AP. That is the earliest photo of me I have doing my job. So again, I will talk a little bit about bringing you inside the newsroom, what my colleagues and I do every day, and some of the things that we've done with philanthropy most recently, which we've been super excited about. So briefly, the Associated Press, I'll talk about that in a second. AP started in 1846, if you're not familiar with it. We got our start as 5 organizations in New York got together around the time of the Mexican-American War, and they said, the U.S. Postal Service is not getting us news from the front fast enough, that we can do it better. And so they got together a Pony Express route, and they got news from the Mexican-American War back to New York City faster. And so collaboration has been part of what the AP does since 1846. We're still doing it today. We have journalists in almost 100 countries. We are committed to being in all 50 states, which is not easy these days. And every year we send out about 400,000 stories 1.5 million photographs and 80,000 hours worth of video. If you saw that photograph of President Donald Trump with his hand raised, it's me in the cargo hold of a C-130 cargo plane flying back from hurricane hunting. This is one of the assignments that you tell your mom after you're back from. And then just a couple more, me, Michelle Obama, and then at the Kennedy Space Center. So I show you these photographs because I've been at the AP for 20 years. After this, I covered this report for 6 years, the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the 4 new justices, the decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, I was part of all of those. At 20 years at the AP, we are doing journalism differently than when I started. All of these photographs were come back with the 800-word story. Well, you guys read some 800-word stories, but not as many as people used to. And so we don't just want to read 800,000-word stories anymore over your coffee Sunday morning. That's not what we're writing anymore. We're writing those, but we're writing other things too. So let me give you an example. Every day at the AP newsroom, inside the AP newsroom, we're asking this question: what is the best way to tell this story? Okay. So I give you an example from this week. This is President Biden pardoning his son. We gave you the 800-word story if you wanted to read it with quotes and outside experts and all that stuff. That's that top story. This is a screenshot of the AP's website. We also, if you wanted to just read what politicians had to say about it, we had that story for you. If you just wanted to read what President Biden had to say, his statement only, what did this guy say? We got that for you. What does it mean? That's that last President Biden pardons his son. What does that all mean? Let's think of 5 things to know. 5 little paragraphs, basically, right? And then we had a video roundup of every time the press secretary said, no, you will not pardon. So you see Green Junk here in 5 different lovely outfits saying no, right? But we told this story in so many ways, right? What is the best way to tell this story in order to get it in front of people, right? Wherever you were, if you were on TikTok, if you were scrolling on your phone, that is our aim every day, is to what is the best way to get this news in front of people. I like this one. When I started at the AP, we did not have video game designers. Anyone who could design a video game, and so that's sort of like what we did for Thanksgiving. Is we didn't just tell you how much your Thanksgiving dinner costs this year as opposed to last year, but if you could go grocery shopping, you could put milk in the cart, and then eggs and butter, and so you got a little bit of a story, and then also like let's actually do it, right? So another way of trying to get there. We're also telling you a lot more about ourselves, how we got the story, how we got the picture. This is my colleague Jacqueline Martin, with the camera she used to capture sailing, and then our David Scott, who runs polling. So if you even watched the election news that night, you saw AP. AP is the one who literally collects voting data from every place around the country, right? So if you watch Fox News, if you watch CNN, didn't matter who you were watching an AP count the vote. And we were really, really intentional this year about sort of saying, like, here's how we do it, right? That's how we build trust, is showing you behind the scenes, from the Olympics and our photographs to the elections. Everywhere we can, we want to show you how we do it. And the last thing, so again, AP, nonpartisan, members of the AP, so the news organizations that get the AP content, right? Thousands of them, radio stations, TV stations. AP is nonpartisan, non-political. Fox News, New York Times, everyone who is a member of the AP gets the AP, right? So our job is to make sure people are well informed when they come to cast their vote. If you listen to our morning meeting, it's also about, okay, you came to the AP's website or a member website and you were reading whatever it was you're interested in. Our goal is to give you something else you want to click on too, right? Not just doom and gloom, but the morning meeting at the AP, we said, okay, like what's the joy in life, right? What else can we get you to read if you're reading something? Is there something else we can get you to read? And then this is what we're asking is like, how do we get you to read, right? Is meet people where you are. And whether that's we meet you in TikTok, we meet you on Facebook, We meet you on your news site of choice, right? We want to meet you where you are, and increasingly where we are meeting people is in their communities, right? So the AP started the AP Fund for Journalism. This will help support local, state and local news. Some of you met my colleague Nancy Watsman, who's here, and she and I, before the election, worked on this project where we got AP News to more than 130 news organizations who had never engaged with us before, because they're small, right? They're starting out. Some of them had literally one person. It was just that person. Some of them were college newspapers. And we were able to give them, because of philanthropic support, very exciting, they were able to access AP content. They were able to access that photograph of President Trump and all the other AP content. Particularly on election night, they were able to access all of our graphics. And so I pulled just 4 of the newspapers, and I pulled the presidential election because everyone wanted to use that map. But then behind this map, what were they doing? They were picking what their community wanted, right? Their local races. And so that's what they got to choose from the AP content that they thought was most relevant to their own readership. We got it to them in Spanish as well. There were a whole bunch of different languages. The AP made these maps and graphics available in. Again, we're trying to meet people where they are, giving new audience access to AP content through philanthropy. I'm a reporter. When we're done, we're supposed to stop. So I'm going to stop there and just say thank you all for the invitation to be here and for reading. All right.
So I think what I'm hearing from this presentation is that there's potential to work within journalism. And of course, I'm seeing just general themes so far with the first 3 speakers: telling a better story, telling a we story, telling an inclusive story, and being inclusive of some of these journalistic entities. I can't help but wonder, and of course, give reading it to you as well. Are there limits to storytelling and trying to get where we need to go in democracy? Seems like we're talking a lot about their power, their potential. Are there limits though to what storytelling can do, to what narratives can do?
Well, definitely. I mean, it wouldn't be great just to invent a story out of thin air that isn't rooted in any kind of reality. And I think if you tried to do that, it wouldn't really hit. It's like a comedian trying to tell a joke that doesn't have some kernel of truth to it. It wouldn't be funny. And so I think the work on the ground is absolutely necessary. I think part of the gap that I'm seeing right now is a lot of really beautiful work is happening on the ground, but it hasn't leveled up to a paradigm shift in narrative.
Yeah, I mean, so I think narrative is incredibly powerful because it's how we filter information and see the world. And just telling a story, if people aren't actually experiencing what they need to experience, whether it's a true story or not. So, you know, we were in multiple countries doing focus groups, and people would say, you know, my life isn't any better since the dictatorship ended. You know, democracy hasn't made it easier for my family. Here in the U.S., you know, I deeply believe in liberal democratic ideals, but we have never been a society that actually fully exercises them. And there are lots of parts of our community that do not have the experience of democracy being something where their voice is heard, where they are treated fairly, where they have freedom. And so, you know, the limits to me, it isn't that the story has a limit. It's if you're not actually looking at what do we need to be doing to say the reason we should stand up for the constructs of liberal democracy are to improve it, or to make them actually experience in people's lives. And there's innovation we need to be doing to improve democracy, and we're not dealing with legitimate concerns, then the stories are going to fall flat. But if we're not telling the story of what it is and what its possibilities are, and how it actually has the best potential to change those dynamics, and that the alternative is far worse from the standpoint of fairness and freedom, then we're exceeding the route.
Just a quick question for you. All those logos on the screen, like, what does that mean to you when you think about like democracy work and going forward, making an investment in that sort of collaborative there of all those logos? Like, what do you see when you see that? What gets you excited
So
about
cool. I was like so cool, right? To get to talk to some of these newsrooms who are, trying to inform their communities. We just got a survey back from the newsrooms that we worked with. 50% of them told us that having AP content meant they got to do more of their own local content, right? They didn't have to send a photographer to something, so that photographer could go elsewhere. They didn't have to send a reporter to something because they could use part of AP content plus their own. That is so cool. I think we were supposed to lead with like hope and change, right? But I mean, that's so cool. Yeah.
Yeah, just quickly, I think that I was probably most impressed by that slide in the sense that, way less than 1% of elected officials are federal elected officials, right? The vast majority are state and local officials, and there's so much that's been decimated in terms of civil discourse on the local level, and so your support for local news outlets is critical.
Amen. Yeah. Are you ready?
Sure.
All right, time for presentation.
Yes.
So I'll do something just a little bit different than everybody else here. So Kristen, thanks so much for the invitation. Pace, certainly appreciate being here. My name's Spencer Overton. I'm a professor at GW Law School, but I'm also the faculty director and founder of the GW Multiracial Democracy Project. Kind of my specialty is voting rights here. Building on Eric's point, democracy is a long game. We've got to play this long game. Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960, they were kind of weak compromises. They didn't deal with literacy tests, they didn't deal with poll taxes, and they were just kind of shortcomings here. A few years later, 1965, democracy to many, I'm sure, must have seemed impossible here when Alabama state troopers attacked marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. But as a result of those, challenges, right, we saw this Voting Rights Act of 1965, as well as the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965. Both of those together basically changed our politics and also changed our population in this country and really set the foundation for our current, the multiracial democracy that we can at least see and envision here, right? Stern Family Fund, other funders, they were there with the movement throughout, right? They didn't give up when things got dark. And it's incredibly important for philanthropy to play the long game. That was then, this is now. What should philanthropy do now? We've heard great ideas, fighting authoritarianism, building strong narratives, supporting local journalism here, putting democracy above politics here, variety of things. I want to flag something else as well for us and just be explicit about it. In 1960, people of color made up 15% of the US population. As a result, in large part of that Immigration and Naturalization Act I talked about, by 2044, people of color, as you all know, will be a majority of the population here. Let me submit to you all that a culture of democracy is not simply restoring some kind of old school civility of the past. It's about creating systems that fit everyone here in terms of our society. Now, it really is easy to discount race. You know, in our last election here, Trump picked up support with black men. He picked up like 18 points among Latino males and actually won the Latino male vote according to exit polls. And it's really easy to say, hey, you know, we've made some progress since George Floyd here. DEI is a target here. It's a risk, a litigation risk, a political risk. Let's step back from all of that stuff. And what I'd like to just say here is, I think that's a mistake. I think that abrogates our responsibility to build a democracy for this future population, a generation from now, in a way that can build, improve lives. You know, we can't talk narrative, at least in the US. We can't talk culture without at least acknowledging and grappling with race and including folks. Now, I do think that there's some hope. And what I'm about to say is really kind of applies to the US, but I think this stuff is happening all over the world, right? Like Brazil, Europe, various places, this question of large, diverse populations, how do they interact with one another and kind of respect democratic norms here? So, first thing, I think it's key for people of color to play key roles in our democracy movement. I'm talking about civil rights groups, but I'm also talking about grassroots groups. I'm talking about experts here. I think it's key that they're at the table, funded, engaged here in the larger democracy reform, not just like an add-on, not kind of in a token way, but playing some significant leadership roles, and they have capacity and expertise to really participate and to engage here. We're working on a project at GW where we got 15 civil rights organizations analyzing PR, fusion, RCV, what are the implications for communities of color here? A 3-year project, hopefully at the end, will help them build some capacity so that they can actually come to conferences and participate in a meaningful way about these different reforms. A second thing here is, you know, democracy has got to be a tool to help people improve their lives and solve problems, as opposed to this just being an abstract concept. I went to Ireland to observe their elections in STV this past May. And I was really amazed at how this wasn't, it was a great trip with Jen. I was amazed at how this was really about culture and how different people can share power and different communities can share power, both in the Republic of Ireland and in Northern Ireland. It was based on a movement of culture. It wasn't sometimes back here we get into kind of these academic debates here about which is best, and it's not rooted in a movement and in a culture here, right? So democracy is a tool to help people solve their problems here. Third thing is we've got to deal with some real challenges, at least those of us who are pluralists here. You know, on one hand, I think it's incredibly important that we respect identity. It's unrealistic to not do that. Failing to do so and just mandating assimilation here is to a certain extent an extension of cultural conquest and is a form of identity politics in and of itself. So I think we definitely have to respect identity, but we also have to be realists in terms of how do we address racial and political polarization that can sometimes come from identity. How do we manage that? How do we really create those bridges here? What's the place in our new multiracial democracy? What's the place for people who are not pluralists, but want to kind of impose their will on others and want to win? What's the place in that multiracial democracy for those people who distrust democracy because of their own racial antagonism or because of their own cultural anxiety. We can't just write these folks off, right? We got to find a place, in a meaningful, constructive place here for them to be a part here. So I think there's a great opportunity here if we real issues. Democracy, as I said, is a long game here. We've got to build a democracy for our future population. Culture and race and narrative all matter. Thanks.
A lot of diversity in messaging here. You know, I'm hearing we've got to get upstream, we need to reform, we need to stay the course, right? So a lot of different perspectives here on the panel. I said we'd leave a lot of time for Q&A. 13 minutes is a lot of time for Q&A. So I'd love to begin that process. If you have a question for one of our panelists or for the panelists in general, we'd love to take your questions.
Hi, I'm James Cohen from More Like Us, and I may have misunderstood or not interpreted what you said entirely correctly. So, Eric, if I interpreted you correctly, a lot of your messaging is like about democracy as an idea and its benefits, and Stephen, it's a lot of like a superordinate identity of kind of we. I focus a lot on messaging, and I think a lot about a better and more accurate story of them, those who are in the other party. And I'm very influenced by More in Common and groups like that talk about the perception gap, which, to bring everyone to this, also shows that in terms of news media, those who read the news the most tend to have the worst, the greatest misperceptions of those on the other side. And when it comes to race in particular, Democrats dramatically underestimate. It wasn't asked of Republicans, but at least of Democrats, dramatically underestimate what share of Republicans think racism still exists, which was actually over 3/4, even though Democrats about like a half of Republicans would actually believe that. So just to make sure that I heard it correctly, or if stories of them also matter.
Is there room to tell better stories of them? Tell better stories of them?
So I'm not 100% following who you're referring to as them, because one of the really dominant pro-authoritarian narratives is an others and outsiders narrative. It's having out groups. It's saying there is a them, as opposed to saying we need to have a story of all of us, and that part of that story is that we have the fearlessness to be able to have difference and be able to have different perspectives. And so what I think I heard you talking about was the places where the misperceptions and the creating a stereotype of them it lends to hyperpolarization. It further polarizes. And so if you're asking, does the story need to be a story that includes them? I would agree with you, though I would say it actually needs to be a story that includes all of us, because the creating of them, what we have found in our research is that folks have multiple identities. Folks who may identify with one political party actually really agree with people in another political party about a specific issue. We saw it, and we're all too early on all the exit polling, but we saw so many places where people voted for AOC and for Donald Trump, where people voted for a right to choose ballot measure and also voted for a Republican president. So I think this construction that we've created that really digs into hyperpolarization is a part of the issue. So I agree with you that we need to make sure that we're not creating narratives and only looking at news sources as being credible and having a basic elite divide. I think that's a part of the problem, if that's the point that you're making. And I think we need to be really cautious about creating these us and them. I'm going to tell one really quick story. There's a campaign issue a few years back called Fight for 15. A bunch of labor movements got together and it was led mostly by women of color in the food service industry to increase minimum wages. And they held Fight for 15 rallies on the steps of state capitals all over the country. And they were the exact same day that all these Stop the Steal rallies were happening on steps of capitals. And so you had these two groups of folks showing up at the front steps of capitals all over the country. And I talked to the woman who was in charge of Fight for 15. She was someone we interviewed. And she said, you know, it was a scary experience. We'd show up. And on the other side of the steps were a bunch of people wearing these red MAGA hats. And we thought this is going to be horrible. And what's going to happen? And are we in danger? And she said, in every single state, the people walked over and said, what are you here for? And they said, we're here to fight for a $15 an hour living wage. And over again, people said, yeah, there should be one. We'll join you. And so that's that place that I don't think we hear those stories or see those stories. And we tend to put people into one category. And that lack of demonization, I think, is really, really good.
I just want to briefly connect. I think your point connects to a really important point that Spencer was making that really resonated, which is how do we as a movement create space in our democracy for people who are not pluralists, wherever they may sit on the political spectrum. And getting back to Eric's point, we have to work even harder to tell a meta story of us. And I think we have many divides right now, and it's certainly not just left or right or elite versus non-elite, establishment versus populist, but also people who are oriented towards politics where we relate to people across difference versus an us versus them mentality. And we have to build a democracy in a space for everyone, and that makes it even harder, but even more important too.
Question over here.
Hi, Jennifer Pay with the ARCA Foundation. I'm curious to know, knowing who's in the room, if you had to think about one particular thing that you would like to see done, not just the next year, the next 4 years, but really within a lifetime, or maybe just 30 years. What is the thing that you hope that we as a collective or you see gets implemented? And then an aside, Spencer, if you wouldn't mind sharing what the acronyms of STV, RCV, and PR for those who want to Google those things over.
I'll let you all answer the first part, and then I'll do the second part.
This feels like an all play. The one thing that you've given us a 30-year window. So I think it's imperative that there's a 30-year investment in narrative infrastructure. And what I mean by that is not a slogan or messaging campaign, but actually making sure that there is ongoing deep support, because no grassroots group, regardless of what side of the political spectrum they are on, has the resources to be doing ongoing deep stakeholder research, analyzing that, and identifying what are the authentic and real messages that connect with people's values and connect to the issues of the day, and have the resource to be able to be supported in applying that. There's a guy at Open Society Foundation who talks about, boy, so many of us in philanthropy invest in helping, in saying, boy, the choir keeps singing the songs the choir wants to hear. And we finally have started investing in making sure the choir can develop a new song sheet by actually finding out what's the music that people need to hear and want to hear and care about. But we don't fund any of the rehearsal time for the choir for the new music. And we don't fund getting them out of the church and out to meet people where they are with it. So I really think if in a 30-year time frame, if we can create a culture of shared democracy by having the infrastructure for the smaller community-based organizations and local communities like what AP is doing, to have that support, I think that would make a huge difference, because I think that's what it's going to take to get to a culture of democracy. It's not going to come from top down, it's going to come from organizations and community groups all over the country having support and resource that no one of them alone can have.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, we haven't heard.
Mine's super easy. more journalists, more journalism. You all know the numbers. I don't have to tell you how many journalists are around when I started in journalism. And I love the manga hat and the, Right for 15 story. The story doesn't necessarily get out to enough people if you don't have that part of anyone cover it. So.
I think your question connects to a dynamic that we saw in the breakout session just before this, which was we were putting on a map where our efforts are generally located, and there is definitely a bias towards the first 5 years as opposed to the kind of 10-year plus time frame, and you're asking about 30 years. And I think one of the biggest plays in that kind of time frame is building, I agree with Eric, building up narrative infrastructure, building cultural infrastructure where the stories are connected with the storytellers. And there are a lot of barriers, there are a lot of obstacles between the two. And those obstacles are sometimes technical, they're sometimes normative, but breaking down those barriers so that the most compelling stories have a platform with storytellers.
I am going to take a shot at your first question in terms of time. I think that we are really can be, if we choose to accept it, kind of the founders of this new democracy and system. I think that formal equality is something that's in the past in terms of people being able to cast a vote, and that was very, very important. And I think we've got this new thing in front of us in terms of, culture, part of its race, there are other factors there of how do you allow people to both self-identify, to be fluid and build new coalitions with other people and respect identity and have politicians attempting to, rather than suppress the perspectives of people, actually appeal to people. So this kind of well-functioning multiracial democracy to me is what our goal is in the next 30 years or so. STV, single transferable vote, it's a system in Ireland. It's a form of proportional representation where they have multi-member districts, but it's not like our system in terms of a winner-take-all system. You have multiple parties that from a single district can be elected. One of the reasons we're looking at that in this project that I talked about is that the court scales back Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act so that you can't draw districts that could elect a Latino or African American. Are there some other systems that don't require gerrymandering of single member districts where voters can connect with one another voluntarily and elect a candidate of their choice? It's very similar to RCV, although ranked choice voting is used in a variety of contexts, not just in multi-member districts here. And then PR, proportional representation, is, like I said, that's connected to the STV. STV is a formula used, a PR formula used. And again, people sharing power. In Ireland, in addition to this voting system, it's not like if you get the majority of the votes, you control parliament. You get chairs, different parties get chairs in relation to their collection of votes. Similarly, in terms of cabinet positions here. So it's not like anyone is completely shut out simply because they fell short of the plurality group, right?
Is it possible to add one thing?
One thing, yeah. One thing. All right. I want to hear one thing.
Not two.
Yeah.
Just one. We got it. So you were just, I just want to add on, you're talking about democracy innovation. And one of the critiques that we are fighting is that good deliberative democracy moves very slow. And the problems that we are facing, some of them are coming really fast. And authoritarians are saying, well, we can get stuff done fast. And there's a false dichotomy of you can't have deliberative democracy and do it fast. You can't have good plurality of voices and not do it fast. We've got a way of thinking about how this must be done that is very, very old and has never completely worked. So there's just an innovation space to be saying the how we do democracy should be a part of what the population of this country is going to be if we're going to have an effective working democracy that meets our challenge. And to me, that's a very exciting moment that could be leveraging some of the power that we all have.
But also, I'll just add that there's often I think, narrative out there that when you're trying to bridge divides and get people across the political spectrum to work on an issue, and I heard this on Capitol Hill a lot too, is we don't have time. We don't have time to be trying to get all these different people on board and building a coalition. The most practical way to make change, and usually the thing that makes progress happen, especially because we've divided government at the federal and many state legislatures, is because you do build a coalition that is diverse and across party lines. Like take criminal justice reform, for example. The First Step Act, between very disparate voices from Van Jones to Koch brothers and Jared Kushner and all these different people, came together and passed the first criminal justice reform in over 2 decades. And there were partisans who were talking about criminal justice reform that entire time and hadn't passed anything. And so I think this is, again, a narrative challenge, because I think that building diverse coalitions is often the more efficient, more practical way to make change.
Well, there you go. Let's give our presenters a round of applause. Really nice. Really nice. Let's engage with them. After this, we'll be heading into a reception on floor 6, not 4, 6 North. So that is where we'll be. It's a beautiful room. And for our members, we'll see you back here tomorrow morning, starting at 8 a.m. We'll have breakfast and then discuss what we as PACE members have gotten out of this and where we go from here. Lastly, we are going to do another round of free headshots. So during the reception, if you didn't have a chance to get a headshot before, which by the way, they are terrific. If anyone's gotten one, you can attest to that. So that will be happening during the reception. Thank you so much. We'll see you at the reception.
So do you want us to just